Good evening, everybody, both online and here in the building. It's really lovely to have you all here to again resume our study in Judges. So tonight we are picking up the second part of the story of Gideon. We'll read through and look at Judges chapters 7 and 8. Last week in Judges chapter 6, we looked at again the people doing evil after the period of Deborah and Barak. And this occasion it was the Midianites, sort of nomadic tribes from around abouts who had Israel under their thumb at this time, and how the people had called out to God, but even in their calling out to God, it didn't seem all that authentic, as when Gideon, under God's command, pulled down his own family's sort of local Baal and Ashtaroth worship, that they were aggrieved at that and were wanting to actually come and to kill Gideon. And so what they were wanting was freedom from the troubles that they'd been experiencing without actually having to give up any of the idol worship, any of the things that they were holding on to that was causing their very problems. And so Gideon, perhaps one of the more reluctant warriors that God has called, we see him really uncertain, initially arguing to God that, no, not me, I'm the least in my family, and my family's the least in my tribe, and tribe least in Israel. Surely there's got to be someone else. And messenger of God just sort of pays him no mind and said, "No, it's you, and we're going to do this. We'll give you into the hand of the Midianites, rather give the Midianites into your hand." And so Gideon famously kind of has to be convinced. And again, we mentioned last week that we're not trying to be too harsh on Gideon. I don't think this is sort of outright rebellion of God, but rather Gideon working through in his own mind, in his own way, just the enormity of the task that God had set before him. And so he has the fleece and these other signs, and so eventually he's convinced, or at least has run out of excuses and options and negotiating tactics. And so we come to chapter 7, and Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, he's called Jerubbaal because he'd pulled down the Baals, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the well of Harod, so that the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And this is where we start to get kind of the second interesting part. So I think the first interesting part of Gideon is this kind of doubt that he works through. And again, drawing it to us that we have uncertainties, we have, difficult relationships with God at different moments in our life. And it doesn't mean we have to abandon our faith. It doesn't mean we have to, convert to atheism or anything like that. But rather God allows us patience and grace to work through those things. Likewise here, we have the second part of Gideon's, I would say, fame, and that's the winnowing down of his army. So we're told in verse 2 that the Lord says to Gideon, "The people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, 'My own hand had saved me.'" It's a really interesting kind of construction here, isn't it? That God is, through Gideon delivering the people, but he wants the people to know that it isn't them, it isn't their might, it isn't their valor, that it is God who is giving them the victory, who is providing salvation. And again, I think we can draw dotted lines across to our own mindsets, our own approach, our own thinking about God and righteousness and the wider world, and how often the wider world, I think, would argue that salvation comes by righteous acts or by acts of charity or by not being as bad as the really bad people. But God makes it abundantly clear that it is through him and it is through Christ, and that without him that we are lost and that we are separated. But at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. So again, this is one of these themes that in lots of different ways kind of gets revisited, the unrighteousness of man, but also the thinking that we have that we're actually not so bad and kind of okay, and bringing things back to ourselves in our own levels, or elevating ourselves towards God in a way that we shouldn't be. And so God is reminding them here in no uncertain terms who he is and who they are to trust and where the power resides. And when they are focused on God, they're able to achieve so much, and they're able to live in peace and prosperity. When they wander away from God, when they complain about their Baals being taken down and whatever, that effectively forgetting God, effectively bringing things back to about themselves in this very self-centered way, then that's when they're in trouble. That's when they're away from God, and that's when God allows them to be to suffer. And so God stating here quite plainly what he wants to do. And so then he gives the first criteria for culling the army. He says that basically whoever is afraid, you can go away. So remember that this army is quite strong, that there are nomadic people, so they're kind of camels mostly, perhaps horses, and it doesn't say, I'm not sure about that. But nevertheless, they're a lot more mobile and certainly a lot more populous, and that they had been under the thumb of the Midianites for quite some time. And so I too would be afraid. I'm easily given to cowardice, and I'm sure I would be one of those who would have been rather reluctant. And so we're told there that 22,000 people returned and 10,000 remained. So basically 2/3. Okay, that's a good enough excuse. I'm out of here. So 10,000 he's left with. And God says to Gideon, the people are still too many. Bring them down to the water. So before we'll have a look here. So initially, 22,000 lead, 10,000 remained, so we have 32,000 there. If you just skip on down to verse 12, we're told what they're up against. Verse 12 of Judges chapter 7, it says, the Midianites and the Amalekites, all the people of the east, were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as the sand by the seashore in multitude. So that's the enemy, that's your opponents. If you skip over to chapter 8 and verse 10, we're actually given a number. We're told that now Zebah and Zalmunna were at Karkor, and their armies were with them. Zebah and Zalmunna are the respective kings of Midianites and the Amalekites. And we're told there about 15,000. So it's sort of spoiler alert here. That's who was left. All who were left of all the army of the people of the east. For 120,000 men who drew the sword had fallen. So again, doing the math, it's not too difficult to figure that there's 135,000 in the army there, plus we're told camels, there's numerous as sand on the seashore. That's a lot. So when they start off and they've got 32,000, it's pretty much 1 to 4. So if they were going into battle as they'd sort of amassed here, in verse 1 of chapter 7, each Israelite is going to have to take on for opponents. So if you're a really good, swordsman and had a spear and got lucky, maybe you can sort of have a really good day on the battlefield and sort of think that you got away with it. So God, as I said, strips them away, firstly with the fearful people. They're left with 1 to 10,000, left with 10,000 people. So that gives you basically 1 to 14. You won't have half people. So again, that's not great odds, is it? I wouldn't like to be going in at 1 to 4. 1 to 14, you're not going to win. You have to run a lot of simulations before you get one victory in that kind of statistics and mathematics. I would say that the mathematic boffins in armies would advise against taking on that kind of a battle, sue for peace or whatever it might be, that you're just going to walk into a slaughter, a bit like World War I, where because of the hubris and the misunderstanding of the generals and of the technology available, that things like the Battle of the Somme was that 300,000 were dead in a matter of weeks, just to gain 1 mile of land that you lose kind of the next week. So just absurd sort of warfare and tactics and loss of life. So 1 to 14, not good. But the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many, according to chapter 7 and verse 4. I will test them for you there. He says, bring them down to the water, I will test them. And then, he says, whoever laps kind of in their hand or laps like a dog to drink the water, they're the ones that you pick, the ones that actually bring the water up and don't, lap it straight from your mouth into the lake. And so he's left with 300 men. Verse 7, by the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Let all the other people go, every man to his place. So these are your odds. 1 to 450. So you can have a sword, you can have a spear, you can have a horse, you can have a shield. Unless you have nuclear weapons, machine guns and the like. Ain't no victory with 1 to 450. Unless you have God on your side. Unless there is divine intervention. Unless there's something else going. Unless ultimately you trust in God. And this is the whole point, isn't it? The whole point isn't to get the maths right. It isn't that there's some magic number that the Midianites just were really vulnerable at a certain point. The point is that the only way you have victory with these numbers is through God, is through trusting in God, is through God demonstrating yet again for a people who had plenty of examples, plenty of evidence, plenty of demonstration, but yet, as we've looked at, who continued to have intergenerational amnesia, who continued to either deliberately forget what God had done or think it was some kind of fairy tale of their, fathers' generations, or who just really liked worshipping Baals and all of the sort of fertility stuff that they would get into and would conveniently forget God. And God, again, allowing them to suffer and then demonstrating for them quite clearly, in this case on the battlefield, 300 versus 135,000 hardened warriors who had you under the thumb. This boring table is a table that demonstrates trust in God. It's a message, I think, again, that runs right throughout the Bible. A message that I need to learn quite clearly. That any people who are claiming a faith in God, claiming to be children of God, need to learn that when we trust in ourselves, when we, like Peter, look around about and see the sea and think about all of the troubles, when the spies go into Canaan and see the giants and all of the bad guys and don't see, the possibilities and the opportunities. When we're relying on ourselves, we flounder. When we rely on God, when we trust in God, when we really trust in God, when we trust in the most challenging, the most unlikely, the most difficult, the most distant of circumstances, we continue to hold on, God will continue to show his faithfulness. And again, it's not that he sort of goes far away, it's generally that we wander away or that we are allowed circumstances that feel very trying. And so, you think, again, how many examples do we have? God does this to Noah, doesn't he? How many righteous people are cheering Noah on as he builds his ark? What are the odds of a flood coming that you need the ark? We won't go into all the texts, but you're familiar. Noah gets mocked, doesn't he? He gets mocked outrageously. And at some level, why would you build a boat? It's probably looking like a pretty foolish thing to do. God told him to build a boat. He trusted that he needed to build a boat. He built the boat. He built the boat according to God's dimensions and material and all of that. And he and his family, 8 people, and the wildlife that needed to survive, did. And all those who mocked, the much bigger number, all those who were doing evil in the sight of God, they perished. Abram was told to go, to leave his comfortable life in Ur and to go into the wilderness, to go down into Egypt, and where he, again, had troubles with his trust. Again, when you trust, the same man who leaves Ur because God told him to, the same man who is prepared to sacrifice Isaac because God told him to, also is the same man who lied about his wife, claiming it was his sister, because of fear, uncertainty, because of this trust deficit that is just a part of who we are. Again, I've mentioned this a number of times in this class, but the exodus of Egypt, God shows 10 plagues in increasing kind of severity and spectacular nature, up to and including, freedom and the destruction of so many of those in Egypt. And yet it really does seem like they are only out a matter of days, maybe weeks, but not a very long time. And they're wanting to go back. They've lost all this trust that surely God had instilled in them. Jonah, told to go, and goes in completely the opposite direction, thinking about the Assyrians, thinking about all of the damage that they had done to Israel, in part probably afraid, but also in part indignant that God would even want to bring these people a message. How can God even offer forgiveness to these people? So in either direction, again, not trusting God's plans, not trusting what God will do. The destruction of Jericho, again, it was not the magic trumpets that got the right resonance that broke down the walls of Jericho. It was their faith, their trust. 7 times, 7 times on the 7th day. That's a measure of what God says to do. And if you carry it out, he will do the rest. David and Goliath, again, there were plenty of people who could have taken on Goliath, who could have trusted in God. And yet it was David who had the trust in order to, I don't think he had the strongest arm that ever there has been. Part of what takes down Goliath is, divine intervention due to the trust that David exhibits, the heart that he has for God. We're told to be baptized for the forgiveness of our sins, to be buried with Christ, to be raised again. it's a sticking point for a lot of people. A lot of people don't think it's necessary. A lot of people don't like that teaching. A lot of people twist it in all sorts of ways. But God said that's what's necessary. God says that's what's to be done. There's nothing magic about the water. We don't have to bring the water in from Italy or from some pure Mount Franklin spring water in Tasmania. The point is its metaphoric value. The point is saying, I understand what God is saying. I understand that I am a sinner in need of forgiveness. I understand that I need to appeal to God for a clean conscience. And I trust that God has done all the heavy lifting through Jesus Christ upon the cross. I don't have to take on Satan. I don't have to take on the burden of my sin, which is overwhelming, which will keep me separated from God, from heaven, from eternal life. God's bridged that. What I need to do is what he's told me to do. And part of that is baptism. And so do I trust that? Or am I going to argue against it? Am I going to find the loopholes? When God says to go into all the world and preach the gospel, it seems pretty daunting odds, doesn't it? What's Toowoomba? 100,000 people? How many people are here? How many people online? Maybe we can count our online audience, and that'll, like Facebook stats, we'll duke it up so we've got actually, 250,000 Christians listening to this class tonight. The odds don't seem pretty good, but God says, I don't care about odds. I care about your trust in me. And I've asked you to go into the world and to be my ambassadors, to let people know. You don't have to convert them at the point of sword. You don't have to eradicate, their traditional ways of life and all of these things. Go, teach, be examples, establish congregations. Matthew 5 verses 11 to 12 says, Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Again, if we focus on the persecution, if we focus on those things, we will suffer and we will abandon our faith and we will try to hold things in ourselves and do things ourselves. But if we focus on that reward in heaven, if we focus on what God has told us, if we focus on the fact that God says we'll be blessed if we hold fast, then the odds don't matter. The persecution won't matter. The difficulties, they matter in that, we can't be blithe about these things. These things do test us. These things do extend us. God didn't want the fearful people in the 300. God chose people who I would imagine, at some level were probably the more trusting. Certainly Gideon, he had a hard-won trust in God as their leader. Philippians 4:13 says, I can do all things through him who strengthens me. You've read that, you've seen it knitted on tea cozies. It's an easy verse. It's not Ecclesiastes 1, 2, and 3. It's not even 2 John. It's only a few words. It's easy to remember. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. This is what he's talking about. If we trust in God, we can go into all the world. We can overcome those who revile and would do evil against us. We can hold our faith. We can grow the church. We can persevere. We can be victorious. Gideon shows that. God shows this again and again and again and again. He doesn't need the numbers on his side. He just needs righteous, faithful people trusting in him, not thinking about themselves, but thinking about the bigger picture. And so that's what happens. That's what happens in this specific case. In chapter 7, in verses 9 to 15, we have it would seem, one final reinforcement for Gideon for his own confidence in the Lord's providence. So basically there's this dream that's described that says, and Gideon's kind of a third party listening in, and they say that he's going to win. And so that finally is the final spur for him. He says, we'll just read it. It happened on the same night that the Lord said to him, "Arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand. But if you're afraid to go down to the camp with Purah your servant, and you shall hear what they say, and afterwards your hands shall be strengthened to go down against the camp." Then he went down with Purah his servant to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp. Now the Midianites and Amalekites, all the people of the east, were lying in the valley as numerous as locusts, and their camels were without number, as the sand by the seashore in multitude. And when Gideon had come, there was a man telling a dream to his companion. He said, "I have had a dream. To my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. It came to a tent and struck it, so that it fell and overturned, and the tent collapsed." And his companion answered and said, "This is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. Into his hand God has delivered Midian and the whole camp." So even after the fire comes out of the rock and burns the offering, even after the fleece and the reverse of the fleece and the dew, all of that, Gideon still needs a final kick over the line. And so someone explaining this dream that Gideon wins this battle is the final kick. And so after all of this, verse 15, Gideon says, "Arise, for the Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand." So now he's ready. Now after all of this convincing. And so verses 16 to 25, the end of chapter 7, we have the description of his victory. Again, you're probably somewhat familiar with it, that basically they take lights and horns, and they blow these and get them going, and it causes confusion in the camp, and they start basically putting each other to death. So the enemy, kills itself, oddly enough. Can we even call this a military victory? I think, again, the point is that this is a victory of God, isn't it? That God doesn't, I'm not going to say how God works, but there's nothing overly supernatural here. It's not like, he separates the river and then, brings it back in again, or he's not stopping the sun or anything like that, or, sending a plague upon the area. He basically causes confusion with the 300 men. Could he have done that many other ways? Probably. But this is what we have here. And so again, I think there's this clear evidence. And so in chapter 8, we have the remaining sort of verses, at least down to verse 21 or thereabouts. We have the routing of the Midianite army, including the kings of the Midianite army. I mentioned towards there at the start the 15,000 that had kind of stayed with the kings after well over 100,000 had been put to death basically by their own sword and by God's intervention. And we also, there's a really interesting passage, you can read that for yourself there, where he's sort of on the way out, Gideon's men are exhausted here. And so that sort of 10,000 that were left, they went back to their place, they do some of the killing as well. It's not all. So they're kind of, in their confusion, they've killed some and then they've gone running, and they've kind of gone running into an ambush. And so, Israel's army do some of the slaying. And then Gideon asks some sort of nearby tribe folks, look, can you give us some bread for our army? And they say, well, have you got the king in your hand? You're telling us that you're chasing him, but, we're going to side with the Midianites. And so Gideon continues on and he tells them, when I come back, those kings will be dead and I'm going to kill you. And he goes and they kill the Midianite and the Amalekite kings. And then he comes back and the people who didn't give bread, again, underline, drill down, who didn't trust ultimately in God's chosen judge, chosen deliverer. They chose instead to trust the evidence of what they'd had previously. They were put to death themselves, slaughtered as a result of their lack of trust. And so then we have this interesting coda, this final sort of bit here in verses 22 down to the end in verse, 32 basically, and then Gideon passes away, and then 33 to 35 kind of leads in a little bit into the next section. But it's really interesting here. So verse 23, we have them wanting to venerate Gideon. So even though, remember in verse 2 of chapter 7, God had said, I want them to know that it was me doing this. Verse 22, the men of Israel said to Gideon, remember the men of Israel tried to kill Gideon back in chapter 6 because he took away their Baal. They say, rule over us, both you and your son and your grandson also, for you have delivered us from the hand of Midian. So these people swinging so wildly and widely. And Gideon says to them, and again, I think this is the right answer. He says, I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. So Gideon knew the priorities. Gideon knew where honour should be given, who the real source of the victory was. But then verse 24 down to verse 27, Gideon gets them to give him all their gold earrings and the plunder that they'd taken, and he creates an ephod. Now, an ephod in the Bible is described in some parts as kind of this really elaborate clothing that's worn. It doesn't seem like this is clothing. Maybe Daniel can explain it a bit better, but it seems like it's some sort of an idol or some sort of object to it. It's made out of gold. It's there. And then we're told in verse 27, then Gideon made all this stuff into an ephod and set it up in his city, Ophrah, and all Israel played the harlot with it there. It became a snare to Gideon into his house. Just like, you slap your forehead, don't you? Just like, so much they'd done. He said, worship God, don't worship me. He'd been shown himself personal evidence. He'd been shown to defeat an army of 135,000. And still it's just, I guess idolatry is so ingrained that, by this time that they'd had multiple generations of pagan worship, these sorts of things. It says there, it was it caused Israel to play the harlot, and it was a snare, a thorn in his side. I don't know why, but again, we have 23, he's opposing the veneration, the worship, the adulation of man. And yet, verse 27, creating something that, an object that was not God, to be worshipped. And so then, to the end of the chapter, we have the death of Gideon, and Israel's excellent for thereafter. No, Israel is not excellent thereafter. Israel is immediately the very opposite of excellent. The cycle continues. We're told that it includes unkindness towards Gideon's house. And told, in verse 34 and 35, children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, Gideon, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. I don't know what the time gap is, but I don't think it's a huge amount of time. From verse 22, where they said, Gideon, be our king, and your son be our king, and your grandson be our king. And yet by his death, they're showing unkindness to his own family. It shows how easy it is for us to be wicked, how easy it is for us to be a long way from God, how quickly it can come, how despite overwhelming evidence, we can be so obtuse, so obstructive, so hard-hearted, the kick against the goad, that despite everything, we still end up in this place. And so the questions to leave us with tonight. Do we trust God? Do we really trust God? Do we trust God when the odds are 450 to 1? In whatever circumstance in your life that might be. Whatever things where you think God is far from you, or you're angry at God, or you're just overwhelmed by sin, suffering, or you just want to not do what God says and do my own thing. And what happens if we are like Gideon and we really try as hard as we can and we still end up making gold ephods? We still find those weaknesses, those things that we've never quite got on top of and run back to so quickly. Gideon serves as an example of trusting God, an example of how easily that trust is lost, and of warnings, I think, to each and every one of us. So we'll finish the online stream there now, and thanks very much for everybody participating, and hopefully it's been of some value and stimulus. Thanks.